All right, all right, all righty. Yes, I'm here. I'm here. May peace and power and elevation be to all the beautiful people out there. This your girl Tiffany coming through here live in the faith. And today's subject, I am going to be talking about Lucreaty Clark. So Lucreaty Clark was a weaver, a basket weaver, and she was a folk artist. So for those of you that don't know about basket weaving, it's pretty common in the South, especially when you go further south, right? Like in South Carolina, it's very common, especially amongst the Gullah Geechee people. And in Florida, it's common, and in various parts of Georgia as well. So what they do is they make baskets. Okay, that's something that our African ancestors did. So that tradition been carried out for the longest. So yeah, just like the quilt, that has been carried out too for the longest. That's very common in Alabama. So anyhow, before I get started, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share the channel, etc. And I would like to thank the new subscriber for coming through. Now, I want to go ahead and share the information that I have available. Now, what I'm going to do is not only I will share the source that I got from Wikipedia, but I also have the book that I would like to share with you guys. Now, some of you guys may be familiar with the title of the book, and some of y'all may not. All right. But I'm just going to tell y'all the name of the book that I'm going to use, anyways. Okay. So, right here, this is the name of the book that I'm going to use for my reference. Right. So it's called Africanism in American Culture by Joseph E. Holloway. Okay, so I'm going to use that. All right, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get started. So let's see, who was Lucreaty Clark? Who is she? Because we got to walk through this. All right, let's get on to it. Let's get down to the nitty gritty of this. Okay. Okay, so Lucreaty Clark was born on February 9th of 1903, and she died May of 1986. She was a Florida folk artist known for basket weaving. She learned how to weave white oak basket from her parents. All right. So she was born in rural Jefferson County, Florida. She was one of the youngest of 16 children in a family that worked on plantation, picking cotton, performing other farm-related tasks. She learned how to weave basket from white oak from her parents, who in turn learned the craft from their parents. Clark's grandparents were slaves on the Rendell plantation near Monticello, Florida. All right. So she got married in 1925. So her legacy. James Dickerson, in an article for the Tallahassee Democrat, described Clark's work. Within her fingertip is carried the memory of an ancient African craft fast disappearing from the face of the Florida Panhandle. African slaves, once brought to the Panhandle to work on plantation, made baskets to hold cotton picked from the fields. So in 1985, Clark was awarded the Florida Folk Heritage Award. Clark taught her grandson Alfonso Jennings the craft of weaving white oak basket when he was a teenager. He further honed his skill in 1983. Florida Folk Life Apprenticeship Program and continued to share knowledge of basket making after Clark's death in 1986. All right. So again, basket weaving was very important. Okay. So basket weaving was very important, all right, to the Southerners. And it still is important. It still has a significance, all right, because that's the tradition. So it's not just about weaving basket and making basket for people, but it's also about carrying on that tradition of the ancestors. All right. Let me say something. The South gets so much flack. The South gets shitted on a lot. The South gets shitted on so much. But guess what? The South carries a lot of African tradition. It don't matter what part of the South you in, you gonna see a lot of African tradition going on. You could be in Virginia, you could be in Kentucky, you could be in Tennessee, you could be in Georgia, you could be in Florida, you could be in South Carolina, North Carolina, you could be in Alabama, Mississippi, you could be in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas. You gonna see a lot of African practice in those states. Okay? You're gonna see a lot of African practices in those states. Those African tradition was kept alive for a reason. To not forget about our ancestors. All right? To not forget about those people. And I'm grateful that I was able to come across this information about this lady here on Women History Month. So now I want to share the book with you guys, which is Africanism in American Culture by Joseph E. Holloway. Okay, a great book in my opinion. I have the first edition. I don't have the second edition, so this is the second edition, right? Now, right here in this book, let me show you guys. As a matter of fact, let me go to the first page. Go. Okay, this is the book that I'm going to use. Okay, walk through it. And I'm going to go where it talks about African religious retention in Florida. Let me go ahead and get through it. So now, right. So before I go there, let's look at the beginning of this. Let's talk about the African practice in Florida. All right, so right here it says 90 issues in African American culture and religion are raised by an examination of the religious experience of blacks living in Florida from the founding of St. Augustine in 1565 through the early 20th century. This essay addresses the cultural distinctiveness of African Americans by placing spirit possession and ritual aesthetic dance at the heart of the controversy over African survivals in the United States. Because the cultural transformation of African American is best viewed as a dynamic process that occurred over a long period, a consideration of the 18th century is critical to an understanding of the relevance of African cultures to American culture. But the bulk of the essay described African survivals in the 19th century Florida. Although ritual scarification, naming practices, magical beliefs, and material culture are mentioned. Emphasis is on aesthetic, religious ritual, musical styles, and funeral rites. This analysis regards religion as the matrix of the 19th century African American life and the centerpiece of the African cultural influences in Florida. Now, let's get to the part that it talks about. All right, so right here, I'm gonna go to the session where it talks about the 19th century. All right, so 19th century. In 1804, about 50 Africans, almost evenly divided between men and women, arrived in Florida and were settled on the St. John River, where their importer and owner, Zephaniah Kinsley, consciously eschewed the imposition of Christianity and other aspects of European culture. Kinsley, who generally purchased slaves directly from the African coast, adopted a policy of non-intervention in all areas of slave culture itself. Manual training. I never interfered with their connubial concerns nor domestic affairs, but let them regulate these after their own manner. If these Africans continue their native dances for a number of years after their arrival, as Kinsley asserted, the likelihood is great that they also continue African styles of worship. In fact, most of the native dances that they perpetuate probably emanate from their indigenous religious pattern. All right. So now I'm gonna go down a little bit. Okay. So it says the African roots of modern African American culture in Florida have been considerably decreased even as early as Reconstruction era, especially as far as the continued presence of individuals who had actually been born in Africa was concerned. By the middle of this era, we clearly are dealing primarily with a U.S. born black population in Florida as elsewhere in the South. Only 88 African born persons were enumerated in Florida in the 1870 U.S. Census. Among the more elderly of these Africans was Jeff Martin, age 102, who had been around 1768 in some unidentifiable region of Africa. Martin, who resided in Jefferson County at the time of the census, was the sole black Floridian who listed his occupation as root doctor. He was one of the 12 African-born persons residing in Jefferson County in 1870. All right. Then let's go down. Let's go down to where it says during and after Reconstruction, black ministers contended with the power of both divine providence and folk beliefs. When in 1880 the horse of a black drayman died after the fellow had cussed out his pastor or preacher, the minister interpreted the man's misfortune as a visitation of divine providence for his cussedness. And equally powerful was belief in the ability of special individuals to cast spell on people who had wronged them. A man in Tallahassee, assisted by an elderly woman, as astounded onlookers by appearing to vomit nails, moss, and other debris. His friends believed strongly in the reality of it all, knowing the Floridian and insist that he had a spell put upon him by a woman to whom he was engaged, but whom he jilted, and who now protests that she intends to pay him off for his base desertion. Now it goes on to say this: most blacks living in Florida during the last half of the 19th century had been born neither in Africa nor in the Caribbean, but in six southern southeastern states: Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, and North Carolina. In 1890, 122,170 individuals, making up 76.3% of Florida's total black population, were native Floridians. Only 5.7% of all Florida born blacks live outside the state of their birth in 1890, whereas between 11.1% and 25.9% of the blacks born in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Virginia did so. Between 1880 and 1890, Florida experienced a net gain of 30,528 black inhabitants through interstate migration. All right. So it says if distinctive cultural patterns bearing traceable African origins are found in postbellium Florida, they cannot be explained simply by the presence of large numbers of African-born individuals in the states. Black such culturally distinctive and widely acknowledged African influence elements of culture as basket making style. Okay, grave markers, mortuary customs, shouting, spirit possession in African American religious ritual in the latter half of the 19th century. These Africanism had become Americanism and persisted in Florida and elsewhere in the Deep South as integral part of interconnection curriculum was it curriculum Caribbean Creole culture that had been forged into Florida, Georgia, South Carolina during the previous century and had alternately influenced and been influenced by the customs and life ways of Southern whites and Indians. All right. Now we're going to go all the way down. It says, dispensing with the possibility of any significant influence by Native Africans still alive during the 1870s and 1880s because their numbers and proportion were minuscule does not, however, remove the possibility of indirect and direct African influence. Some of Florida's older American-born black adults, such as Reverend Eli Boyd, remember deceased African-born parents and grandparents. A self-designated Geechee interview in Miami during the 1930s, Boyd recalled that my grandfather was brought directly from Africa to Port Royal, South Carolina. The possibility of vivid memories of African-born parents and grandparents was underscored strikingly in a conversation I had with Richard McKinley, the son of a black Baptist minister who figured prominently in the history of Live's Old African Baptist Church. The McKinley family oral tradition persists links of kinship stretching from Jacob and Ashanti African born around 1820 to the present. And while the proportion of Florida's black population born in Africa had diminished to statistical insignificance by 1870, personal memories of African family ancestors had not disappeared even as late as the 1930s, when Shaq Thomas, born a slave in Florida in 1834, recalled that his father was from the Congo. Poppy was a African. I know that he come from Congo over in Africa, and I heard him say a big storm drove this ship somewhere over the Carolina coast. I remember he mighty respectful to Massa and Missy, but he proud too and walked straighter anybody I ever seen. He had scars on the right side of his head and cheek. What he say and try marks, but what they mean, I don't know. All right. So it says, from these and other African ancestors no longer in the earthly world when the census takers made their rounds in the 1870s, some older country-born black Floridians, such as Mrs. Lucreaty Clark on Lickman, Jefferson County, may have learned African basket weaving techniques handed down across several generations, as did George Brown, South Carolina. Although South Carolina's African American basket weaving tradition, which Peter H. Wood said undoubtedly represent an early fusion of Negro and Indian skills, is widely known and highly visible to tourists along the coast roadside of the Low Country. Less attention has been focused on the tradition of basket weaving still practiced by some African American craftspeople in Florida today. In describing the white oak basket made by Lucreaty Clark, James Dickinson wrote, of course, within her fingertips is carried the memory of an ancient African craft fast disappearing from the face of the Florida panhandle. African slaves once brought to the panhandle to work on plantation made basket to hold cotton pits from the field. Right. So, it says the tendency once was to assume that in those instances where Africans did not bring African-made artifacts with them in the slave ships, there was no possibility of reproducing the ancestral material culture. That is entirely too physicalistic conception of how diffusion even of material culture works. The specific materials from which the artifacts are made is one thing. The form and design and concept of the artifacts are another matter altogether. All right, so just to pretty much stop right there. If you guys don't have this book, you need to get it. Africanism and African culture, and I'm stressing this with emphasis for a reason. Now, I had seen some that was that was very intriguing. We got people who claim the Gullah Geechee culture and try to say that that's Native American, and that's not true. That's not true at all, and this is a disrespect to those ancestors. It is a big disrespect. You cannot disrespect African people by claiming that you're Geechee and say it's Native American culture. The Native American people were not Geechee people. Okay? That's disrespectful. Now, 9 times out of 10, this woman, Lucreaty Clark, she probably was a Geechee woman. Okay? Because the Gullah Geechee people go from the peninsula of South Carolina, well, from North Carolina, actually, from on the coast of Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way on down to Jacksonville, Florida, Duval County. All right? So, it could be a possibility, a chance that this woman probably had some Geechee in her. Okay? But when I hear people make statement about the Gullah Geechee folks and try to combine them with the Native American culture as opposed to African culture, you're out of order. You're out of order and you are totally disorganized. And how dare you sit there and disrespect those African people? Those African people who are Gullah Geechee came from the Angola and Congo area. All right. As a matter of fact, they was one of the first Africans before anybody else, because the Spanish people brought them over to what is known as South Carolina today. Georgetown, South Carolina, in particularly in Winyah Bay. There was over 100 African slaves being brought over. Again, we trace back the Gullah Geechee people, go back to the Angola Congo area, right? The Bakongo people, the Mende people, which the Mendika tribe is a part of, just to name a few. And, and people say things like this. This is disrespectful. This is 100% disrespectful. It is 100% disrespectful. Period. You cannot disrespect the ancestors like that. And we have allowed too many people get away with disrespecting our ancestry and what our people have done. We allow people to get away with disrespecting those by saying that slavery never exists, and we continuously listen to these individuals. We allow people to get away with saying that we're not African descent, but we're Indian and all of that. We allow people to get away with trying to tell us that we should not, that Pan Africanism wouldn't work for us because it doesn't help. It doesn't connect us with anybody, and they don't understand that Pan Africanism is a form of networking. We allow this shit to happen. We allow shit like people using the concept of African history just to shit on other people and not respecting, not honoring it, and not being very genuine about it. But anyways, you guys, that's all I have for today. I hope you all have a good one. So next time, peace and power, elevation be to all of you. This your girl Tiffany. I'm logging off saying deuces. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. Make sure you get that book, Africanism and African Culture. If you gotta get edition 1 and 2, that's great. Get both of those books. All right. Until then, y'all be safe. Until next time, deuces.